Epiphany follows the 12 days of Christmas, and it commemorates the Magi, the wise men, coming to visit Jesus. And it really illustrates a tension that was felt by the early disciples that we still feel today, which is this tension of this celebratoriness, this celebration that Jesus has been born, and they bring these gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh, and it's riches being poured at the feet of the baby child king. And at the same time, it's when Herod, the earthly ruler, is out to murder this new, completely innocent, truly innocent God in the flesh. There Jesus is. And in the process of trying to murder Jesus, murders many other children in Bethlehem. So that celebration of the King has come, salvation is coming to the Messiah, the one who restores us, is coupled with death, destruction, and pain. And 2,000 years later, one of the chief reasons that many people say they struggle to believe in God is because of the problem of evil, because they see that the world is filled with death, destruction, and pain. And they say, well, if God is there and He's promising to heal and to bring restoration, why is the world the way it is? And we know it's because of sin, because God has given us free will and He's allowed us to have dominion over the earth, and therefore our sin doesn't only affect us, it affects each other, it affects creation. But yet the promise of the Savior was, this is all going to come to an end. A new heaven, a new earth. And this isn't just from the New Testament. This is from the Old Testament. This is from Isaiah that we just went through right before Advent. If you were with us those weeks, over the course of 8 weeks, went through the entire book of Isaiah. And it's all about the new heaven, the new earth, the new Jerusalem, the end of sin being washed white as snow, the end of disease, the healing for everyone, for all those who are following God, all those who are His people. And so the Jewish people were looking forward, many are still looking forward because they don't believe in Christ, to that time. They were looking forward to that. And yet, as Jesus came, we see again the Magi, they come, and it seems like such a celebration. And yet, it's followed up with pain, suffering, hardship. As we've just celebrated Christmas, we've probably focused more on one than the other of these two sides of the tension. I'm guessing that you and your family were focused more on the celebrating and not on the tension and hardship. I'm not really sure how you would celebrate that as a family. For Christmas, for most of us, at least in Norway, it's a time of presents, taking vacations, going to Christmas markets, whether it's here in Norway in a place like Egersund or pre-COVID. Many times people travel to other parts of Europe. We have fantastic Christmas markets selling and celebrating all sorts of things from special drinks and sausages and ornaments and these different things. It's seen as a time to celebrate and to treat yourself and to treat others around you, to hopefully be generous both with those you love as well as with the poor and others. That's why we always take up an offering at Christmas to help the poor, because it's a time to not only be generous with our families, but beyond our families. Jesus said, even the heathens are good to the people that they love, that are nice to them. We need to be good to even those who are the least of these, who are the poor in spirit, who are even hateful toward us. And so we that's one of the things we do at Christmas here at North Sea, is take up an offering as an expression of our gratitude for God and His generosity, and as an exercise of our own generosity and denial of ourselves, to be sacrificing. We focus as well, hopefully, on the birth of Jesus. We sing familiar carols, which we did over the last month here at church. You may watch special movies that bring memories to you, whether it's from your childhood or things you've enjoyed watching since then. Enjoying crackling fires. And it's easy for us in the midst of all that to forget that the promise in Jesus' coming of the happily ever after hasn't quite happened yet. And for many people, it feels much farther away than it may feel for you. He came with a promise, a new kingdom, no more sickness, no more war, no more hunger, no more poverty, no more broken relationships, no more sin of any sort. And yet, here we are in 2022 in the thick of it. Is there still war? Are there still broken relationships? Is there still sin? In some ways, it seems like it's only gotten worse. So this morning, I want to read out of Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet. And then here we have a quote from the Old Testament. And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, that I too may come and worship him. After listening to the king, they went on their way. And behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. Now, this passage here in Matthew 2, a couple of things that stick out to me. Herod believes the prophecy. Do you see this? He doesn't say, oh, that's silly fairy tales. No, he believes the Old Testament. He believes what the prophet has said, and yet he knowingly and willfully rebels and rejects God's own Messiah. It's absolutely incredible, and it's the height of all arrogance, because what person in their right mind goes, yes, I believe this is what God has said, and I'm going to fight God and win? But that's exactly what he's doing. It's open, blatant rebellion against God. But one of the things this tells me, too, people have all sorts of reasons for denying God, and nowadays in the West, we tend to think that it's atheism. There's people that don't believe in God, and if they just could believe in God. The reality is, for generations and for ages, most everybody in the world believed in some type of supernatural, whether it was a god or gods or spirits. And they always find a reason to reject God. So it's not in some type of intellectual issue today. It's not any different than it's ever been. Even in the Old Testament, we read in the Psalms, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. So the problem is a human heart condition. And it's only by the grace of God that we can come to know him. It's by his grace he reveals himself to humanity. It's only by his grace that you're here and that you're not accounted among the lost. And it's sad to see that people can have such rebellion, and yet we also know that God can break through. That even people like Herod, God loves. And that God is reaching out, and that we are to be a light, even though we will likely be persecuted for it. Jesus said, they hated me. Don't be surprised when the world hates you. Herod, he summons these wise men. Obviously, he lies to them, and then they go off. They find Jesus. They find him in a house, by the way. You're probably aware that this was not actually 13 days after his birth. We don't know how long. Was it 9 months later? Was it 2 years later? We're not exactly sure. But it was some time period. And note, Mary and Joseph and Jesus are still in Bethlehem. Probably when they went to Bethlehem for the census, they were actually moving there. Well, clearly they were moving there. They're still there. It was probably done intentionally. And perhaps that's one of the reasons that when they get there, everywhere is filled up. Maybe it took them a little longer between her being pregnant and with them having perhaps all these tools and things of Joseph's. For surely he would have brought those things with him so he could have his business as a carpenter to be able to provide for his family. It seems they were leaving Nazareth and going there and going to make a life for themselves, as much as we can tell reading between the lines. So they don't come, they don't meet him as these nativity sets often show them and the shepherds there. That's not the case. At this point, Mary and Joseph are no longer living in a cave or a barn. They're in a home. They have a life there. They've come, and they bring gifts. And we don't know how many wise men there are. We three kings of Orient all, that we sing that song. Well, that's just because there's 3 gifts. There's got to be at least 2, because it's plural. Could have been 10. Yeah, it's unlikely that it's too huge of a group. These are rich, wise men, and we figure they might have had a large entourage, for surely they don't Rich, wealthy men at the time, and even today, don't travel just alone by themselves on a lone camel. Again, those pictures we have, surely they had an entourage with them and servants and these things. But we don't know how many for sure there were, but this is a huge honor. Now, of course, for them, there's no threat. They understand this to be the king of the Jews. Hey, we want to honor the next king. Herod, of course, feels quite threatened by this idea. It's incredible how God can sometimes speak and use those who seem so far from him, while those who should be close to him are left out. Herod, now he wasn't really rightfully a king of Israel. He married into the Maccabee family. It's a whole different story. But the point is, here he is, sort of Jewish, half Jewish, having access to the prophets, and yet he rejects God. And here these people are from far away who are not part of God's quote-unquote chosen people, and yet they come to know him. And it's really a picture of what's going to happen later, isn't it? Like even here at Jesus' birth. His own people will crucify him. Some will follow, but many will reject him. And yet the gospel will go to the Gentiles, which includes most of us. And so those who are far away are brought near. We're grafted in. And so we see this beautiful picture of foreshadowing, even here with the wise men, that this is what will end up happening. But we see that tension, this celebration, this young child being honored, and yet still pain and suffering in the world, and not yet realizing the fullness of the promise that Christ brought with him. And it reminds me of a tension that was particularly faced by 3 American astronauts over 50 years ago on Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1968. It was when humanity orbited the moon for the first time. Bill Onder, Jim Lovell, and Frank Borman were in their capsule. And Jim captured this famous picture, Earthrise. It's just always stunning to me as they came around the moon and they saw the Earth rising, coming into view. They knew as they came around the backside of the moon, they were the first humans to ever see the backside of the moon, because we always see the same from Earth. They were going to be able to reestablish their connection to Earth and address humanity. You see, before they set off, the NASA Public Affairs had told Borman that they expected 1 billion people, that's in 1968, a quarter of the Earth's population, to be tuning in to the Christmas Eve TV broadcast when they came back and reestablished connection. Imagine the pressure being told you get to address basically the entire world. Those that aren't watching are going to hear about it. And so there they were, and they told him, the NASA Public Affairs officer said to him, more humans would be hearing their broadcast than any other human voice in history. And so he told him, just say something appropriate. So while he appreciated the freedom, he didn't know what to do. He found coming up with something appropriate to be absolutely impossible. All 3 of the astronauts and their wives kept trying to figure it out, but they couldn't. Their initial attempts all focused on the idea of peace on Earth, right? It's Christmas Eve and all this. But you know what they discovered? Attention. How could they, as Americans, be up there in space looking over this beautiful blue marble saying peace on Earth and goodwill toward men when America was embroiled in the Vietnam War? And they tried to address that. And so then they realized, well, this isn't working. And as they tried to address that and try to soften it and make it work and make excuses, they realized it began to sound like a big apology for the U.S. being in the Vietnam War, which is not what the astronauts wanted to do. And it began to take the focus away from the fact they're orbiting the moon. That's the point. And they just found it just wasn't working. Why? Because as they're wanting to focus on Christmas and on Jesus, they also realize it's not perfect yet. And they're not perfect. And their country, however impressive its accomplishments, was far from perfect. So they went to a friend who introduced them to another friend who was a journalist. He was a veteran war correspondent. His name was Joe Layton. But Joe had the same problem. Everything he tried to craft, he started looking in the New Testament. He was trying to find a connection between the Christmas season and the biblical accounts of the birth of Jesus, but he kept having this issue, the whole war issue and what's going on with America. And the story is told, he was sitting up all night, crumpling up paper and throwing it away and trying again and crumpling up, throwing it away when his wife walked by. Now, his wife was a former French resistance fighter. She suggested, why don't you just start at the beginning? So with the TV cameras rolling, December 24th, 1968, as the spacecraft approached lunar sunrise on Christmas Eve, the crews start to read from the book of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. They read the first 10 verses. You can actually see this on YouTube. You can look it up. NASA's posted it, the actual video. You can see the camera. They've got the camera videoing the moon as they're going by, as they read this. And they ended there, and God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. And God saw that it was good. And then they said, and from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, and Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth. Borman, in an interview later, says, we were quite convinced it was the most appropriate thing to do, because there's a sense of awe on my part, at least that the universe is bigger than all of us. It's too orderly and it's too enormous not to have some sort of divine creation. But thinking about that struggle, choosing the right words to address the entire planet, wanting to give hope and yet realizing that you're an imperfect messenger, that even in all the glory that you see there ahead of you, seeing the earth rising, that there's pain and suffering if you zoom in just a little bit. Now, some Christians want to view the Christian life like we celebrate Christmas today, that it's all presents and feasting. But perhaps we would be better off to view the Christian life as a journey around the moon, something that was incredibly difficult and took sacrifice and yet resulted in awe and a fulfillment that was incredibly satisfying. I mean, why did they do this in the first place? Because it was hard. That's what JFK said. It was a chance to gain knowledge that could be, quote, in JFK's words, used for the progress of all people. As a matter of fact, in that famous speech, John F. Kennedy used 3 strategies of why we should go to the moon. It was because there was an adventure to be had. It was because there was an urgency for the sake of the world. And because we need to live up to our heritage as a people. And all 3 of these apply to an even greater extent to the Christian life. It is an adventure to be had. There is an urgency to it for the sake of the world. And we need to live up to the heritage that we have. The great cloud of witnesses, those who have gone before us, and living a life according to the calling which we have received. It isn't easy, but God provides all we need to succeed. From the very beginning, we see that it wasn't easy. We just read these first 12 verses, and it sounds so wonderful, except for that little bit about Herod. But the wise men, they leave it a different direction. But of course, you know what happens next. But let's read the next 3 verses. Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, Rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, quote, out of Egypt I called my son. Joseph and Mary had to make what was surely an exhausting journey to Bethlehem, and then give birth to Jesus in what was not the most ideal situation. And then after some period of time, whether it was 9 months or 2 years, but enough time to perhaps feel like life is finally getting started. Maybe they'd finally made some friends, finally had a routine, maybe had a local synagogue that they liked, and things seem to be going well. Suddenly they're having to move again. Now, many of you know what that's like, except probably you didn't have a king with assassins out to murder you. You just had a company telling you to move, perhaps, or a family, or for whatever choice, perhaps because of marriage or love. But many of us, of course, have experienced moving, sometimes moving unexpectedly or sooner than you'd like. But again, this is on top of it because, well, having murderers after you is tough. And also, they didn't have airplanes. They're fleeing across, and there was no passports. They've got to go to Egypt as immigrants, as foreigners. There's language issues. Again, we all understand this to an extent. But we do have things like, Google Translate, and we have things like websites we can look up, and if we're moving somewhere, say, what's it like to live here? And places to find apartments. And imagine, they didn't even have GPS. Just going out, let's head west, let's find Egypt, let's figure out how to live there and stay out of Herod's reach. This was no small matter. It was tough. It was an adventure. It was urgent. Those two are definitely true. And they were living up to their heritage as God's people. All three of those things. But what was it not? It was not easy. He didn't say it was going to be easy and safe, but he is good. He was good to Mary and Joseph. How in the world did they afford to move? They had to move quickly. He may have had to leave behind many tools. We don't know, right? But what did they have? Frankincense, myrrh, and gold. God provided what they were going to need before they had to flee. So it wasn't easy, but it was doable. And this is the life that they had experienced. We see this from the beginning. And if it was like this for Jesus, the Son of God, the Messiah, why would we expect it to be any different for us? Why would we think that it's got to be all easy for us? So they go to Jerusalem, and they bring Jesus there. They bring him to the temple. It goes on, it says here in Luke 2, verses 36, and there was a prophetess, Anna, the daughter of Phanuel, of the tribe of Asher. She was advanced in years, having lived with her husband 7 years from when she was a virgin, and then as a widow until she was 84. And she did not depart from the temple, worshiping with fasting and prayer night and day. And coming up at that very hour, she began to give thanks to God and to speak of him to all who were waiting for the redemption of Jerusalem. So now it seems that Anna comes as a prophetess, and she's prophesying about Jesus, and there's more confirmation here. You've got Simeon, you've got Anna. It's incredible. She begins to preach to people present. Either way, you know what's really interesting to me is that the first evangelists were shepherds and a woman. The shepherds in the day and this woman here. God was not going to play by human rules, because shepherds nor women were respected in Jesus' day in Israel. And to this day, he often chooses not to play by our rules, the way that we think God will act or behave. We see this throughout the Bible. We see when Moses hits the rock, and the next time God says, talk to the rock. And Moses doesn't like it. He wants God to play by his rules. But again, we can't try to get God onto our agenda. We've got to say, God, what do you want to do? How do you want to do it? Let me play by your rules. Now it says she spoke to all who were waiting for the redemption of Jerusalem. And yet to this day, that redemption, it hasn't come the way they thought it would. It didn't come with a great military victory in a short time. Jesus didn't grow up, and at 30, like David, who at 30 became king of Hebron, at 37, king of all Israel. They would have been expecting Jesus as a young man to begin to seize the reins of power and throw off the yoke of Rome. But again, God wasn't playing by their rules. Instead, those who followed Christ were persecuted in the years following Jesus' ascension, and still are so often around the world. Pliny, who is an author and a magistrate, Pliny the Younger, who is the nephew of Pliny the Elder, but Pliny was an author and a magistrate of ancient Rome, and in a letter once, he felt it necessary to investigate an issue with Christians. Further, he'd already investigated, but he investigated it further by having 2 female slaves, who were called deaconesses, tortured, which was standard procedure in Roman interrogation of slaves, and discovered nothing but, quote, this is Pliny's words, depraved, excessive superstition. Pliny used the word superstitio in the Greek, or superstitious, our translation, instead of the word religio, or what we would translate religion. Pliny chose his words carefully, and by using the word superstition for Christians, he was denigrating the Christian's position, because it was outside the religious practices that were acceptable to Rome. He was trying to make them look like ridiculous, superstitious people instead of anybody that believed something rational like they did with Jupiter and Saturn and all their pantheon of gods. The apparent abandonment of the pagan temples by Christians was a threat to the Pax Deorum, or what they could call the peace between gods and humans. And so they were worried that as humans were no longer going into all the pagan temples, that it would disrupt the peace. Or more possibly, as an administrator, the money wasn't coming in for all the sacrifices and things they do at the temple. Pliny ends his letter by saying that Christianity is endangering people of every age and rank, and has spread not only through the cities, but also through the rural villages as well. but that it will be possible to check it. He argues for his procedure to Trajan by saying that the temples and religious festivals, which before had been deserted, are now flourishing again. So he's also building himself up, saying that he's dealing with the issues. Tacitus was a Roman historian and politician. He's widely regarded as one of the greatest Roman historians by modern scholars. He talks about how Nero inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, Christ, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, or Pontius Pilatus, as he writes it here. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, talking about Christianity here, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Well, yes, true, Christianity had made its way to Rome and is spreading around what was their known world at the time. Accordingly, an arrest was first made for all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city, setting the city on fire, as of hatred against mankind. But Tacitus goes on and says that Nero inflicted mockery of every sort, was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle and was exhibiting a show in the circus while he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer. He was wearing costumes or stood aloft on a car. Hence, even for criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, there arose a feeling of compassion. For it was not, as it seemed, for the public good, but to glut one man's cruelty that they were being destroyed. But this was the life that Christians endured for the years and decades following Jesus' ascension. It wasn't easy, but he never said it would be. I'm not saying there's no joy in this. Of course there's joy in it, but it's hard. And at the same time, as we said before, it's all part of living up to our heritage, of doing something that's urgent for the world, for the sake of humanity, and it's going to be an adventure of one sort or another. So as we close today, everything that's great takes great effort. Olympics, business, getting a PhD, anything that's kind of worth noting is something that's going to take effort. Right? We don't celebrate people like, I know we nowadays may have like little graduations from Barnahaga, but in reality, if you're like 40 years old going, well, one thing I graduated from Barnahaga in my life, nobody's impressed with that. Right? We're impressed with hard things. Whether it's building a company or being an Olympian, winning a contest, going and getting a PhD. These are things that are difficult, and yet these are things that are held in high regard because they're difficult. Why do we expect the Christian life to be any different? If it is something that is great, shouldn't it also take great work? Do we not think that if the greatest honor of all humankind is for the Lord Jesus himself to one day look at you and say, well done, my good and faithful servant, that it's not going to be as easy as graduating from Barnahaga? That maybe it's a little bit more difficult, that it takes a challenge, that it causes you to grow and have to strive and become a better person than you are today? I would think so. So as we head into the new year, my goal is not to discourage you about life, but rather to encourage you in the pursuit of God. Jesus promises that his burden is light, that we will have all we need in him. But we do have to put some effort in. But it's not an impossible effort. It's not impossible by any means. It is entirely possible because his joy is our strength. His burden is light. In our weakness, he is strong. So he enables us to accomplish every task that he sets before us, so we know that we will succeed as we set out to follow him. But he never says it will be easy. This is simply not in the Bible. It is a race of endurance. It is those who persevere. It is those who take up their cross, who die to themselves and offer themselves as a living sacrifice, who ultimately succeed. So for the next step today, I encourage you, as you start this year, to commit yourself to Christ, whatever the cost, like never before. And how do you do this? Through prayer, Bible study, Bible memory, fighting the flesh, and more prayer. We see the Spirit present here in Simeon's life prior to Jesus' ascension. We saw the present Spirit in creation in Genesis 1, and he is active today with everyone who is a true believer, who has been born again by the Spirit. It is by his power that you can succeed. He grants his power to those who pursue him in faith. Not just to everyone, but to those who are believing in him, pursuing him in faith. So we do not rely on ourselves, but we must fulfill our responsibility in obedience and following and pursuing him. So as you begin this new year, what will you do differently to ensure you are giving your all in hopeful expectation of receiving his all? Like the boy that we read about in the New Testament with 2 fish and 5 small loaves, you will always get far more than you put in because he can always outgive you.